Thank you, Hunter. Welcome to the Bob Woodruff Foundation's Got Your Six Good Intel webinar series. This is our third session in the series. Our goal is to continue helping to elevate the functional expertise of the Got Your Six network and to give you those tools in your toolbox to best serve your communities. I'm Deirdre Armstrong, the Director of Local Partnerships at the Foundation. I'm thrilled to see so many familiar faces on videos or names on the call today. And there's lots of folks tuned in who participated in the previous sessions. I'm really excited that you're back for more. Most of you are already part of the Got Your Six network, made up of our local partners and grantees. Thank you for your tireless work to support veterans, service members, and their families across the country. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. For those on the call less familiar with the network, take a look at our website where you'll find a directory of our local partners, as well as a submission form if you'd like to learn more. And Hunter will share that link in the chat. I'd like to start here with a brief poll. This allows us to build a baseline of your understanding of the topic we're going to cover today. You should be able to see it on your screen, but the questions are, how often do you rely on storytelling and narrative to advance your organization's mission or stakeholder relationships? And then, what is your organization's greatest challenge in storytelling? Great. Thank you for participating, and we will share another poll at the conclusion of the session, helping us to understand how the information informed you on this topic. Today's session will focus on the power of narrative. Some things we'll cover: what makes a good story? What stories might a funder want to hear? How can I teach others or build that culture of storytelling in my organization? And I'll pivot there to introduce our real experts, our speakers today, Emily Krause from our grants team, and Kate and Ree from our communications team. And I'll hand it over to Ree to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Dee. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I love these opportunities to connect with the Got Your Six network and to talk about comms, which is something that I get really nerdy about. So have you pop onto the next slide, please, Hunter. We're going to just cover really quickly what we're going to talk about today. I was in the Air Force, and they teach you when you're briefing the Air Force, tell people what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. That's what we're going to do. So like Dee said, we're going to cover why narrative matters. We're going to talk about some of those questions that you may be facing as nonprofit storytellers and some of the challenges that might come up, from what makes a good story, like Dee said, to what types of stories do funders want to hear, and then some of the pitfalls and challenges you may encounter with telling stories and how to tell them ethically. We'll also cover a little bit about how to begin integrating stories into your overall communication strategy. And importantly, how can you play a role in establishing a culture of storytelling in your organization? And then we're going to cap it all off with Emily Krause giving us 3 simple storytelling formulas you can use across platforms. So why stories? Why, of these 3 topics that we did for this webinar series, did we make one about narrative? Well, the answer is that story is vital to our survival as humans, and it's in our DNA. This quote here from Brene Brown is from a book that we will include in the materials that we share with you after this webinar. Stories are powerful. We're primed to communicate in stories. From the beginning, we've used them to communicate the information that keeps us alive. That could be, I went hunting over there last night and I almost got attacked by a bear. Those kind of cautionary tales. We've also got the stories that help us make meaning of the world and help us connect with each other. We've been doing this for eons, and it is literally in our DNA. Next slide, please, Hunter. Let me show you how it shows up in our DNA. when we sit and hear a story, and a story is considered, I'm going to use a definition from Paul Zak. He says it's a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. When we hear a story, it releases hormones in our brains. So here's a little bit about what your brain does when you're on stories. Our brains release the stress hormone cortisol when we are noticing tension in a story, when we see conflict in a story. The reason that's beneficial to us as storytellers is that heightens people's awareness. That chemical is designed to help us survive those scenarios, those encounters with a bear. So heightens our awareness, keeps our focus, and it helps us with memory, which is of course important if we want somebody to take an action based on the story that we've told them. It's also very important, another very important hormone that gets released is oxytocin. You might hear this called the love hormone. This is the chemical that helps parents bond with their babies. And it really helps us connect with one another. It improves our empathy. And in fact, it actually increases our generosity. There's a 2007 study by Paul Zak. And what they did was they took two groups, one group, placebo group, one group that they pumped full of oxytocin. They gave them the money from, participating in this, and then they gave them the opportunity to donate. Those who donated, who were full of oxytocin, donated 80% more than the placebo group. So it literally makes people feel more generous. That's what we want to tap into with our storytelling. And you can advance, there we go. Another consideration as you're putting together these stories is that when you see an image, your brain processes that so much faster than if you read text. It would take me a solid paragraph to depict what's happening here in this really inspiring picture of the Rams victory at our recent tournament, or the Wheelchair Football League's recent tournament. But your brain can process certain visual information in 13 milliseconds. That's wild. So if you hear that a picture is worth 1,000 words, you can be sure that it's actually worth a lot more. Because everything we talk about today, from the brain science of it just now to the theory and what makes a story, we want you to be able to apply all of it in your work. So I want to have a moment here where we'll pause and think about who you're going to be targeting when you tell these stories. Now, we bring the funder perspective to the table, and all of what we talk about today is going to be tailored to reaching funders, whether they are prospective funders or funders with whom you have an existing relationship that you want to deepen and advance. So I'd like you to take out a sticky note or open your notes app or open a doc. And I'd like you to write down responses to each of these three questions. And I'm going to give a little pause so you have time to do them. First of all, who's your target audience for the stories that you want to tell? Pick a specific funder, like an actual name or an organization, and write that down. And once you've got a name written down, start to think, what do I think they want and need? You can use information you already have from your interactions with them, information you've gleaned from their website, or just intuitively, what is it that you think they are looking for when they are seeking, folks to invest in? And take a second to write that down. Now, once you've got that captured, we're going to think about what limitations they have on their time, on their attention. We're sure they're very busy people that might influence how you tell this story. There might be a medium that is easier to get your story in front of them if you use this medium, or that might impede your chances of having them absorb the information in your story. So just take a note of what things might cause friction in their day-to-day life that will make it hard for you to get your stories in front of them. And now, as we advance to the rest of the slides here, I want you to think about this person and apply what we're learning, in the context of this individual. Now, what makes a good story? The things that make a good story, we're going to make a grilled cheese sandwich here. And what I mean by that is when you make a grilled cheese sandwich, what makes it good is the ingredients that you put into it. And so we're going to take a look at the ingredients of a story. These are the story elements. You might remember these from middle school language arts. We're going to dust them off and we're going to go back through them briefly here today. So we recall each of these elements and what we can do, some good ideas for bringing out the most in each of these elements. So you wind up with the best grilled cheese sandwich that you can possibly make. So first of all, we've got our setting. The setting is an opportunity for you to show your community or showcase the environment in which the subject of your story is living. The details of the setting are what help make it real. So as you're, say, writing a story or capturing information in an interview, make sure you're asking questions that pull at all five senses. What did it feel like? Was it cold when you were living on the street? So that your listener or reader in the end is able to put themselves in the shoes of the person and understand the environment. And imagery can also be a way to establish a sense of setting. So keep in mind that sometimes place photography is going to have a place in your stories. Next up is characters. Can't have a story without characters. It doesn't work. Ideally, you want your beneficiary to be the protagonist of your story. That's your hero and the person you're going to center the story around. And there's a quote, I wish I knew who originated it, but perfection is the enemy of authenticity. And that's what I want you to keep in mind when you're picking a protagonist or a hero for your story. They don't have to be perfect, but they do have to be rootable. You want to make their wants and desires clear and relatable so that people can see themselves in this character, even if they don't have the same experience. Now, when you're casting your organization in this story, they're going to be a supporting character. The reason is we want to root for a human being, an individual person, right? We can be excited about the work your organization is doing, but it's really this individual story that gives it meaning and gives it context. So ideally, you don't want to cast your organization as the hero. Cast your veteran or your caregiver or a survivor, family member as your hero of the story. Imagery also will help you put a literal face on the character. I know it's not always possible, and we're going to talk about some workarounds later, but some considerations for good people imagery are things like making sure faces are clear and in focus. Make sure you're capturing a moment of emotion or of action. And ideally, you want either a person on their own doing something in their element or interacting with another person, because that's when our emotions really start to flow, right? Now, when it comes to plot is basically the structure of the story. It's the journey that we're going on with the character in your story. To build tension and keep interest, you need that beginning, middle, and end, like we mentioned earlier. And there's lots of ways to structure your story, and we're going to share some later in the form of those storytelling formulas. Now, conflict. This is also vital to building tension and getting that cortisol released so people pay attention to what's going on and want, our hero to thrive despite this circumstance. Conflict can come into a few different categories. It can fall under person versus person. You're not likely to encounter this in your work, but you may. Person versus world is more likely. And if you define world as nature or society or the system, chances are you have a lot of stories in your network that fall under this category. And then person versus self is also a really poignant type of conflict, and it's very relatable to people who are struggling with mental health, struggling with just the stress of transition, maybe people who are working through a substance use disorder. Those types of struggles within the self, we can really get a lot of conflict and empathy that comes out of those. Now, resolution. Our story has to go somewhere, right? We said journey earlier, so the resolution is where we end. And the ending should inspire action by arousing an emotion. That's what we're trying to get out of people. There's a couple different ways we can do that. We can go negative and we can get that anger flowing. And anger is a very actionable emotion. It's one of the most actionable emotions, right? But it's a little bit of a negative connotation. This one you might find handy when you're talking about big systemic issues and things that are not fair. Why is this still happening for veterans in our community? Another way we can approach it is to inspire awe or excitement. These are the ones where you look at someone, you say, wow, it is so inspiring what that person overcame. I want to help other people do that. So inspiring awe and excitement, positive and actionable, or anger, negative and actionable. They're both useful and valuable, and there's a place for them both. If there's no resolution, invite the audience to be a part of the ending. And we're going to give you a formula that works for that too. Although if you are doing reporting, for instance, and this story is supposed to be reporting, hopefully there is some kind of a resolution for your story. Now, theme. This is the thing that is going to connect your character's experience with the human who is, reading the story and consuming it. It should be something relatable. So even if their experiences are different, they both care about the same thing. Taking care of family could be a theme. I wanted a safer community could be a theme. Serving others is important to me and I want to continue doing it. That could be a theme. And then coming home is like the classic veteran theme, right? That's what the Odyssey is based on, the experience of coming home. And if you look at your mission and your mission involves helping veterans find a place, safe place to live, and use the theme of coming home, boom, there's a connection that makes sense thematically. And your theme, you want your theme to connect back to your mission. So with that, I am going to hand things over to Emily Krause from our grants team, and she's going to give you the inside scoop, the funder perspective on what stories funders want to hear.
Thanks, Ree. First of all, funders are people too. It's worth saying that up front. We want to relate to the person whose story is being told, and we want to understand their experience. And as Ree already said, we want to walk away with a feeling that drives us to action and motivates us to get involved or stay involved. It's also important that you tailor both your message and your medium to your audience. And what I mean by that is that different funders will respond better to different content and themes, but also to different storytelling formats. Maybe short, highly visual, shareable tweets are the best way to capture one funder's attention, while another prefers to engage with more long-form, issue-driven content like blog posts or other publications. Get to know your funder and start working to meet them where they're at so you can capture and keep their attention on your work. And finally, funders want to understand their role in your work. For prospective funders, you can use stories to show them what could be possible with their support. For current funders, keep in mind the expectations attached to their funding and show them what has happened with their support. Next up, from the grants team perspective, I want to share a few common storytelling pitfalls that we see. So when we award funding through our grants program, there's a storytelling component to our reporting requirements. So we receive and read a lot of stories from our partners. The first common issue we see is a story that doesn't relate to our funding. I already touched on this briefly. We can usually pinpoint this issue because of either the timeline or the services described in the story. So consider when you're talking to a funder, whether you're sharing a story about someone who went through your program 2 or 3 years ago, or did you receive funding for your housing program, but you're sharing a story about someone who received employment services. In both cases, these stories are showcasing the impact of your organization, but not the impact of your donors' dollars, which is really what they want to see. The workaround for this is pretty simple. Make sure you're telling a story that is directly connected to your funding and its intent, or in other words, just speak to your audience. If you're in an early implementation phase with a program or still enrolling participants, that is okay. You might think about telling a compelling staff story in the meantime. That actually can also be a great workaround for programs addressing needs that are highly stigmatized or that raise privacy concerns, which we'll touch on a bit later. A second common problem we see is a story that lacks focus. We know that you all have a lot to say about the great work that you're doing in your communities, but too much detail can actually make it hard to identify key points in a story and what the reader is supposed to walk away with. So consider particularly that if you hope to have your stories amplified by your stakeholders, it's easier for them to do that if the material they receive is focused and concise. Basically, just help your reader out. Think about what you want them to take away and make sure you're driving your point home. A great solution to this can be using a simple storytelling formula to give your stories more structure. So later on, I'll share a few that you can use to help shape clear, compelling narratives. Finally, sometimes we see stories that lack resolution. As Ree mentioned, resolution is a key ingredient in a compelling and meaningful story. The way we see this might sometimes be a story that describes the needs that a veteran came in with and shares that now that veteran is enrolled in a program. Well, the next question is, to what end or purpose? A story that ends in the provision of services isn't really telling the full story of your program. I would encourage you to think about compelling stories in terms of meaningful change. This can be change in circumstances, change in access, etc. So for example, let's frame a story around a veteran experiencing homelessness. One version of this might be that this veteran has been missing a lot of telehealth appointments and check-ins with their caseworker. So a program provides them with access to a cell phone, and they have now achieved more consistent participation in care and services. This story describes a change in access and demonstrates progress towards longer-term goals. Or we could look at the same veteran experiencing homelessness and say that through participation in your program, they've been placed in permanent supportive housing. That is a significant change in circumstances. In both cases, the real goal is to make sure that you're documenting what has happened and what has changed over time. And actually, I want to say that if you attended our first session on logic models, some of this should sound familiar to you. And you could consider how each of these storytelling pitfalls might be avoided by simply looking back at your program's logic model. And if you didn't attend, again, be sure to check out the recording on our website, which Hunter linked in the chat. Specifically, think about the needs you're addressing, the activities you're conducting, and the outputs and outcomes you are producing with your resources. That is a story arc. So storytelling is your opportunity to put a human face on your program impact, but your program's core logic should still underpin every narrative. It's a reinforcement of the value of what you do, and that's really what a funder wants to see.
Emily, thank you so much and so well said. And I forgot to mention this when I was introducing Emily, but Emily is also a playwright. In addition to being a programs officer and an important part of our grants team, she brings a storyteller's perspective to this. And that's why later on, she's going to be the one to share those formulas with us. So thanks again, Emily. Now, while we're kind of on this cautionary note here, we'll continue with a few places that we need to kind of tread lightly and be careful. What are the ethics of storytelling? How do we tell a story ethically? First and foremost, I want to acknowledge that pretty much everybody here is probably already doing this. So let this just serve as a reminder. Fundamentally, the ethics of storytelling is about prioritizing client safety, privacy, comfort, and dignity. Consent is king. It's number one. The way that we enact this is by equipping our teams to request permission and make sure that you have releases signed so everything is, kept legal. And then keep the veteran looped in during the story development process. This is one that can be easy to forget, especially as people get excited about the story and the way that it's unfolding. The number one person who has to be happy with the way this story unfolds is the veteran who's sharing their story. And sharing story can be an empowering process or a disempowering process. And then a lot of that hinges on how the story develops and how involved they are. And speaking of involving people in storytelling, I want to talk about how approaching storytelling should always be done through a diversity and equity and inclusion lens. You want to be intentional about applying this lens because it doesn't necessarily happen on its own or organically. If you don't get intentional about it, you just kind of keep momentum in the direction that things are going. And a good mantra to keep in mind comes from the world of disability advocacy. It's nothing about us without us. So if you're telling a story about someone who has a certain experience or a certain identity, make sure that person is engaged in the identification of the story, the development of the story. And even in the planning phase, make sure you've got the voices that you want to uplift engaged in the planning phase as well. Ultimately, it comes down to wanting to ensure your communities are the community you serve is represented from the ideation process through development. And the reason it's an important one is that there could be somebody in your community right now who takes a look at your website or takes a look at your blogs or your social media presence and thinks, I'm not sure this service is for me because I don't see anybody like me represented in these stories. So just keep that in mind as you're taking a zoomed out look at which stories you're telling. Now, depicting stigmatized topics, I won't beat a dead horse on this one, but we know that the veterans that finally raise their hand and ask for help have often come through a lot of challenges, and they may or may not be things that they are willing to discuss publicly. And even if they have accepted all parts of their story and they're not ashamed of anything, they still may face social stigma or discrimination based on the experiences that they have. That's around things like mental health, food insecurity, homelessness, unemployment, legal issues. Just as a society, we're not fully there yet. So you want to make sure the person is only sharing their story when they're ready, emotionally ready, set up with what they need, and when it's not going to impede their goals. For example, when I worked with veterans experiencing homelessness, I had some folks make some amazing progress that would have been a really good interim story or small win story, but sharing it publicly might have undercut their ability to actually get hired in that permanent job. So of course, you're going to keep that in mind as you're selecting stories. And then when we're talking about people's experiences and their different identities, it's tough to know exactly like what somebody chooses to use as their identity. So a good place to go as like your home base is person first language, which, for example, would be a veteran experiencing homelessness instead of homeless veteran. If somebody says they prefer identity first language, especially around things like disabilities or race or gender, that's okay. Respect what they want first and foremost. But if you're not sure how to talk about it, a good and respectful place to start is often person first language. And speaking of that, you can kind of zoom out from the person first language to look at an overall asset-based framing approach, or kind of strengths-based framing. Now, asset framing is an approach pioneered by Trabian Shorters. A few years ago, we went to a CIF conference in Chicago. I'm wondering if anyone who's on here was at that. I went to Trabian Shorters session, and it blew my mind. It changed everything I thought about storytelling and the way nonprofits tell stories. And fundamentally, his approach comes down to the idea that the words we use matter, and it benefits all of us to define people first by their goals and their aspirations instead of by their challenges. So when we choose how we're telling these stories and we choose what language we use to describe their experiences, we have an opportunity to really make it an empowering experience, to make it one that frames their desires and their goals and their dreams instead of the worst thing that ever happened to them, that they're now dealing with the fallout of this thing. Let's see here. If you want to learn more about asset-based framing, we will include a link in the materials that we send later on. And then how do we work within this construct? Okay, so many stigmatized topics. How do we tell stories? Well, you have to offer multiple on-ramps to help people share their stories. And there are a few workarounds to de-identify a client. You might already be using some of these. And if you have any other ideas, go ahead and throw them in chat. One is an anonymized story where you use stock imagery, but use it transparently. So you let people know that the names are changed. You let people know that the person in the image is not the veteran that you're talking about in the story. Another option is kind of creative framing, taking a picture, but not identifying someone's face. So it could be an action shot, someone's hands at work, that kind of thing. Another option is to have a team member read a thank you note from a client. I'm sure you probably all have a thank you note from a client in a drawer somewhere that really touched you and put you back in touch with why you do what you do. How amazing would it be to put a camera on the caseworker who worked with that person, or the team member who did intake with that person, and have them read the note on camera. It makes it so that you don't have to show the person's face, you don't have to say their name, but you get that double emotional impact of the person telling their story in their own words and the caseworker processing the emotion of it. And then we, as from a funder perspective, there are things funders can do even to kind of help the flow of stories, knowing when you're dealing with these stigmatized topics. And I'd like to throw back to Emily real quick so that she can explain how BWF approached that.
Thanks, Ree. So one solution that we offer our grantees is the opportunity to share a story from a program staff perspective, which again can be helpful with participants who are hesitant to publicly share their story just yet, or with services that have legal and privacy restrictions. And I have a couple of successful examples of our partners sharing these stories. One is a story framed around a case manager who's the daughter of an Army veteran, passionate about serving the military and veteran community. She shared that she was proud of her ability to meet veterans and families in crisis and provide them with relief, and specifically shared that because of BWF funding, she's been able to expand her reach to help more families, preventing several evictions, keeping the lights on, and helping them recover from financial crisis. The reason this story works is that by compiling or by telling it from the perspective of the case manager, they were able to compile multiple client impact stories. And this created a larger overarching narrative about what BWF funding has helped them to achieve. Another great example is a story focused on an Army and National Guard veteran with past experience of homelessness, who is now an instructor for a program providing career training to veterans experiencing homelessness. As a result, he can relate directly to what these people are experiencing and takes pride in sharing his own story to help motivate them and improve their confidence as they work towards their goals. The reason this story works is really simple. It is built on lived experience. Whether you're highlighting a staff member who has gone through the same program they now work for, or has simply experienced some of the same challenges as program participants, a story like this creates a longer through line for the impact of your program, and it ties in broader themes of service and giving back to the community.
Emily, those are awesome examples, and thank you so much for sharing them. So that could be something that you, as you know, as our partners in the Got Your Six network could consider as you are doing not just reporting, but creating blogs and content and all the your comms work. And speaking of comms work, we've talked about what makes a story and some of the cautions to keep in mind. Now let's see how we can put it all in action. I'm going to throw over to Kate, and we're going to talk about how to integrate stories into your comm strategy.
Thank you, Ree. Hunter, will you advance? Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about implementation and integration. Start with the strategic work that your organization is already doing. Build from your mission first. So keep in mind things that you already have to deal with. So established needs like funder reporting timelines and requirements. Make your comms work for you, woven in with the work that your organization is already planning to do. Storytelling is not an additional burden, it's essential to your operations. So one idea would be to look at your organization's larger events calendar and consider how you could use storytelling to build momentum around an event and how you can leverage a planned high point to work for you well after that event has ended. So for example, let's say you have a community engagement event in June. Can you lean on storytelling, like the theme maybe of meet our team leading up to that event on social media? Can you get a few quotes during the event about what issue in the community your program is tackling? Maybe a short video of the action that you can put on social media with a caption for context. You can bundle all this up into an email update afterwards. You can pull things out to have long tails and to work for you. So my suggestion here is to build from your mission down to themes and then down to stories. So there are multiple uses for all of the content that you collect. Work smarter, not harder. For example, a blog post can be tweaked slightly and used for social, for email, for even repurposed to pitch media. If you pull some facts about an issue to provide context, include a story about how you're addressing that issue, and you have the bones of a really good pitch for media. Don't be afraid to repeat yourself. Reinforce your mission and your message. New donors and funders and champions are crossing your path every day. So let's look at a handy visual that can kind of help you structure your comms. So this looks like a lot, and we can share this resource again afterwards for you to reference. It might look overwhelming, but really this diagram boils down to planning around your organization's needs and capacity. So You don't need to do a weekly blog if that's too much, but maybe you do need to share monthly updates. Organizing your story building blocks as you go, or considering your audience and your platform thoughtfully. So is this story just sort of bite size? Is it enough for a tweet update? Or is this story perfect for an email to those donors? And evaluate the success of these stories as you go. So what action did you want your audience to take, and are they taking it? You may have a similar strategy built for your organization's operations, but as I mentioned, communications should be taken just as seriously and integrated into that larger plan. So now we're going to share some awesome examples from our network. This is a great one. We love this email example from our partner, ASAP. They found a really unique way to showcase their impact. So this is an email introduction to one of their comedy bootcamp instructors. It's concise in just a few short paragraphs. We're getting his personality and we're seeing how he's benefited from the program. This interview format is also a very, very handy tool for the person who's handling your comms. With a Q&A structure like this, the piece is set up for you to slam dunk. It's a good one. We've got a really great social media example. Shout out to our local partner, Veteran Services of the Carolinas, for these successful posts. Anyone can be a reporter from the field for your organization. So ask permission, get your camera out and snap some photos. Thinking about Ree's comments about the ethics of storytelling, you'll notice that these pictures were taken in a certain way. So for example, in the lower left-hand side, protecting the identity of the man in the maroon coat by photographing him from behind. And in the other photos, the individuals are in focus and engaged. The first example is also pretty interesting because the character in the caption in the short story that's putting a face on their impact is actually their peer support specialist. So they went to their team for a story. That's a great example. And the second is really strong in story structure. We know who this veteran is. We know what problem she was experiencing, and we know how they intervened. So, and the imagery in all of these is especially strong. And you'll notice people have masks. I know masks are the thing now, but you can still capture a lot of emotion and interest in a photo. Let's look at a website example. So this is a stellar one. First, the headline in the lower left is captivating. It's a preview of the arc that we're about to read. It's pulling me in. And then you'll notice that this is a mix of profiles on the veterans that they're serving and their veteran team members. A series is a great format. A series is a great tool. It can, especially on a website, it can lead visitors who enter through one story to click through and explore more. If you're doing a series, plan your post cadence based on your capacity and your needs throughout the year. So that could be weekly, monthly, quarterly. A steady drumbeat is easier to follow. And next up, we have a cool example of, and this is kind of a shameless plug for our own Bob's List Google group, but there are a lot of channels out there to amplify your stories. We can get creative. For example, in our Google group, like called Bob's List, it's a one-stop shop to get your work in front of peers and champions who will carry your content farther than your existing audience to new eyeballs and new potential donors. And we have advocates in that group that have huge social media followings. For example, Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist and Craig Newmark Philanthropies, he's in there and he's happy to share since he's a champion for our Got Your Six network. So drop links to your social posts, your blogs, your recent press, your stories, so that we can help you share that good news widely.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'm going to jump in to talk about a few simple storytelling formulas you can use to help you in this work. Remember again that a story needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. It does not need a traditional happy ending, but it needs to take us somewhere that's different from where we started. So the formulas I'm going to talk through provide a framework that can help give you that structure, and they can be scaled up or down depending on the platform you're using and the audience you're trying to speak to. First up is Dave Lieber's V-shaped storytelling formula. This is probably the most common framing that we see for our participant impact stories. And I want to especially highlight that in between points 2 and 3 of this formula, that is where your program occurs. That's your intervention point. We got a great example from this from one of our grantees. It's the story of an Air Force veteran who was struggling to find his place after his transition, jumping around from job to job, unsure where to land. That's our main character. In 2020, he got surgery for a wrist injury he sustained during service that resulted in the loss of a lot of movement in his hand and made it really challenging for him to find work. Eventually, he became homeless and moved in with family. Then this veteran expressed an interest in coding, and the local VA connected him with our partners who provided a laptop, tuition assistance to complete training, and personal hygiene items. He graduated last summer and now has a paid internship and is preparing for full-time employment. He said, quote, "The journey is still there. I'm still working at it, but it's getting there," end quote. This story is clear, it's compelling. It tells us who this person is, the challenges they were facing and how they worked to overcome them, and allows him to speak to his experience in his own words. It's a great story. Another formula you could use is the Carnegie formula, incident, action, benefit. This could be useful if you're thinking of how to prompt a participant to share their story in their own words. It could also be a great way to share organizational insights and invite your stakeholders to join you in a desired action or solution that is working for you. Finally, I want to share the before-after bridge formula. I find this one really exciting. This is a zoomed out framework. So maybe your organization is telling the story of a systems change level initiative, or your vision statement is framed around a long-term goal like ending veteran homelessness or food insecurity in your community. A great example of this narrative formula is our partners at StrongStar. They identified a nationwide shortage of community-based mental health providers who were trained in evidence-based therapies for PTSD. That's the world with a clear problem. The future they're working towards is one where every community has a network of clinicians who are providing this evidence-based mental health care to address PTSD. And the way they're working to get us there is by providing a training program that reaches out to community providers and trains and qualifies them in these treatments. That's a strategic long-term action that they can invite stakeholders and funders to join them in. There are more storytelling formulas you can find and implement based on what best serves your organization and the work you do. But above all, remember that these are a tool and a template to help guide you as you develop and share your stories. I'm going to pass it back to Kate.
Thanks, Emily. So how do you create a culture of storytelling in your organization? How do you get everybody on board? Well, no matter what your role or your title is, everyone is a storyteller. Your fundraising lead is an asset. Your program leads are assets. Your executive director is an asset. Stories can come from anyone in your organization and they benefit everyone. So reinforce storytelling as it's an organizational priority. It's not just nice to do, it's tied closely to raising awareness and dollars. And you can help support this by making time in your schedules to internally celebrate and recognize stories, and by empowering your team to know what to look for and to, again, sort of report from the field of their work. A quick photo, a caption for context, small wins really count.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kate. And I love the idea about creating time internally so that everyone can get accustomed to recognizing a story and being able to surface and elevate those stories. So we're just going to recap what we talked about before we ask for questions. And if you have questions already, feel free to start typing them out in chat. So we covered why narrative matters, some of the brain science behind it. We talked about the structure of a story, and we talked about the elements of story and how infusing to those elements with certain considerations can result in a really quality story. We talked about some of those common pitfalls and how we tell stories ethically. And then Kate just gave us some great tips on integrating stories into our comm strategy and building a culture of storytelling. And thank you, Emily, for those storytelling formulas. And we will actually include a link to, I think it's 11 storytelling formulas, an article that you can check out and see if there's something else that would work even better for your organization. So now we would like to open it up for questions. First, I'm going to throw it to Dee.
Thanks so much, Ree, and thanks, Emily and Kate. I really appreciate your expertise, and I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone on the call did as well. We will go back to that poll I mentioned at the top. Hunter's going to share a brief poll. How likely are you to use what you learned today to help your organization tell stories? And then would you like to receive additional information? And this just really helps us as we plan out future webinars, how valuable this information was to you today. Great, thank you. And recognizing we have about 10 minutes left, we will pivot to the question portion of the webinar. And I received a couple by direct message